Well, session number 201, looking at the first part of chapter 10, beginning in verse 2 through verse 12. Actually, we'll probably reread verse 1 as in the process. We've entitled it God the True Shepherd, perhaps better, Christ the True Shepherd. Well, where did we leave off? Well, again, we left off with verse 1 of chapter 10. Let me read it for you. Ask Yahweh for rain in the springtime. It is Yahweh who makes the storm clouds. He gives the showers of rain to men and plants of the field to everyone. So, and now when we get into verse 2, in contrast to Israel's faithful God Yahweh, we're going to show abundance to Israel. I'm not sure that made any sense, but we'll continue and go on. Verse 2, the idols speak deceit. This is the contrast, of course, with Yahweh. Idols. These are small household idols. The idols speak deceit. Diviners see visions that lie. They tell dreams that are false. They give comfort in vain. Therefore, the people wander like sheep, oppressed for lack of a shepherd. And that is, you give trust to idols, diviners, and prophetic dreamers, or dreamers who claim they're prophetic. This is a misplaced trust. It's what God's trying to tell the people there. Again, the idols mentioned were called, I think, teraphim or something like that. Small household idols. If you remember, when Jacob finally got away from Laban and took his wives and his kids with him, Rachel stole Laban's household idols. They were these same kinds of idols. Genesis 31:19, for example. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. So, idolatry, a vain act. It produces nothing of value, nothing of use. Idols are false. Diviners are false fortune tellers. Dreamers are false prophets, selling false visions as though they came from Yahweh. It's all imitation, folks. But who were these guys that are being discussed? Certainly they're not talking about the idols themselves. No, they're talking about the so-called shepherds who were to be the leaders in Israel. So that fall into probably three categories, right? The kings or rulers, and of course at the time of Jesus they had no king sitting on David's throne. The only king was the Idumean Herod. And so who else? Well, false prophets, priests who didn't do their job well. False leaders and shepherds are almost always the focus of God's anger toward Israel. If you don't look at the people of Israel individually and their sin, then you're looking at the false leaders predominantly. Let's look at Jeremiah 14, verse 22. Jeremiah asks some questions. Do any of the worthless idols of the nations bring rain? Be talking about Baal in particular there, I think. Do the skies themselves send down showers? No, it's you, Yahweh, our God. Therefore, our hope is in you, for you are the one who does all of this. All the blessings, of course, are from Israel's God. And God knew that. Look at verse 3 of Zechariah 10. My anger burns against the shepherds, the leaders of Israel, and I will punish the leaders, for the Lord Almighty will care for his flock, the house of Judah, and make them like a proud horse in battle. And remember, Haggai and Zechariah were sent to Judah with the returning captives returning from Babylon. So, there is something very interesting. It says, what? I will punish the leaders, but I will care for the flock. Interesting, the word punish in Hebrew, the word care for in Hebrew, same word. Just depends on the context. So God dealt with false shepherds all through the Old Testament. And he says here, false shepherds enrage him. That's not the explosive rage of temper as a human being. But God said it really ticks him off when he has bad or false leaders for his chosen nation. But he made another important declaration. It's this: future divinely sanctioned rulers will all come from Judah. Did you notice that back in the verse 3? I will punish leaders, for the Lord Almighty will care for his flock, the house of Judah, and make them a proud horse in battle. Well, he's going to come up with a little bit further statement about the house of Judah. Remember, for example, Zerubbabel, the governor appointed by Babylon, or actually appointed by the Medes and Persians at that time. Zerubbabel is a descendant of Judah. Through whom? Zerubbabel was in the lineage of David. He was the ruler of Judah, but he wasn't a king. He was an appointed governor. And so will the Messiah be from Judah, from the line of David, as we know. That's Jesus, our Christ. Look at Micah 5:4. Talking about the Messiah. He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they, the people of Judah, will live securely, for his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And of course, that is a prophecy about the coming Messiah. Well, what's God doing? He's warning idolatrous leaders, and he's going to say, I am going to take care of you. I'm going to watch over my flock and care for it. So he's encouraging his people here. Look at verse 4. And here's where we talk about the fact that all the divinely appointed leaders, rulers, kings will come from Judah. Verse 4. From Judah will come the cornerstone. You know that term is often applied to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ. From him the tent peg. From Judah comes the tent peg. In a tent, the tent peg generally refers to the center post on which the whole pressure of the tent rests, and which was also used to hang all kinds of things that you owned, all your utensils, all of your belongings, you would hang on that tent peg. So in a sense, the tent peg represents the center point of all of the support for Judah. From him, Judah, the battle bow, from him, every ruler. And again, cornerstone is a term often applied to Messiah. We spoke about the tent peg being an indication of central support, and the battle bow an instrument of war to be yielded or wielded, probably is a better term, by Yahweh in defense of his nation. Did you know, again, where all the rulers were to come from? Which tribe? Well, we've been harping on that, right? Judah. The line from Abraham through Jacob, through Judah, through David, all the way to Jesus. Zechariah is setting up, remember, some end times prophecy. So the end times are in view everywhere in chapter 10 and then all the way through chapter 14. Look at verse 5. Together they will be like mighty men trampling the muddy streets in battle. Because Yahweh is with them, they will fight and overthrow the horsemen. Did you notice what they just said? That the ground troops, the infantry of Judah, will defeat cavalry, horsemen. So they're on foot, but they will defeat anybody that comes using horses to wipe them out. God says, I'll take care of it. So he's going to support the Jewish fighters. His presence, of course, is a supernatural empowerment. Bottom line, Jews will win the war against a superior enemy. And this was, again, remember we talking about near fulfillment and far fulfillment? Well, this was partially done during intertestamental times, at times of the so-called Maccabees, in which the Jews did have some victory, war victory, particularly when it came to Greece, for example. The promise applies to both northern and southern kingdoms. When Zechariah starts this now, he's really talking about a unified nation. Although, as we will see, that unified nation did not hold from Zechariah onward. It was broken again at a later point. We'll talk about that in the next couple of sessions. So let's look at verse 6. Where he's going to make the point about bringing the two kingdoms together. Northern kingdom, Israel, southern kingdom, Judah. Verse 6, I will strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph. There's the northern kingdom. Called the house of Joseph. It's called Ephraim. It's called Samaria. It's called Israel. It's called all those names. Goes on to say, I will restore them, the two nations, because I have compassion on them. That's God speaking, of course. They will be as though I had not rejected them, for I am Yahweh, their God, and I will answer them. So the final regathering of the entire unified nation of Israel is in view here in Zechariah. So Judah and Israel will be rebuilt and restored by God. Its reunification is a product of God's compassion. And they're going to enjoy security. The state of affairs of those two will show no effects of all of the times that Israel forgot who their God was when they went to idolatry. At that time, God's going to hear their prayers for deliverance, and He will fulfill their prayers as He is a promise-keeping God. The Lord, He is the source of all of the Jews' joy. Look at verse 7. The Ephraimites, that's the northern kingdom, will become like mighty men. Their hearts will be glad as with wine. Their children will see it, the product of this nation, and be joyful. Their hearts will rejoice in their God, in the Lord. So next, the northern kingdom is being encouraged. Look at verse 8 too. Not 8:2, but 8 also. I will signal for them and gather them in. This is an end times prediction. Surely I will redeem them. They will be as numerous as before. Remember, the northern kingdom really wasn't identifiable as a kingdom, as a people, as a group after the Assyrian takeover of the northern kingdom. But it says now from the lips of Yahweh, Israel's going to increase in numbers, but not in a foreign land like Egypt and Assyria, to which they had been shipped and exiled. The tenses imply that Israel's redemption was a done deal in God's mind. And of course, when God says something will happen, it will happen. So this reunification, restoration back to influence and power is going to happen. Even Paul in Romans, remember Paul made a statement, someday all Israel will be saved. By the way, back in verse 8, there was a word where God said He would signal. Well, that's the word whistle. It's if God's whistles and Israel's going to come running back. Look at verse 9. Though I scatter, do you know what the word scatter is in Hebrew? Jezreel. Keep that in mind. When we went through the book of Hosea, remember Hosea named his first son Jezreel, where God says, I sow or I scatter. So here he says, though I scatter them among the peoples, yet in distant lands they will remember me. When they're exiled, they'll remember me. They and their children will survive. They will return. I will bring them back from exile in Egypt. I will gather them from Assyria. I will bring them to Gilead and Lebanon, lush parts of the Palestinian countryside, and there will not be enough room for them. That's kind of an interesting statement, because God said there's not going to be enough room for everybody I bring back. But believe it or not, they will not find a shortage of room. God will see to it that they all fit. He scattered, God scattered, but He's going to regather the portion that remembers Him. The regathering now has two components, redemption and multiplication. He's going to redeem them. He will take the remnant as His chosen people, but He will multiply their numbers greatly. Incidentally, you remember what Zechariah as a name means? God remembers. Well, for generations, the Jews had survived with the hope and expectation of a final homecoming, but that hope had never been more than partially realized, especially when they came back from Babylon. They didn't even have the whole nation. They were even quite limited within Babylon, within Judah itself. And still they have not gotten back all of the lands under David's control, for example. So the full restoration of Israel has never taken place. Partial restorations, yes. Partial fulfillments, yes. But the full fulfillment awaits. The number of Jews is going to increase beyond the land's ability to hold them, but still it will hold them. That's our God. Let's look at Deuteronomy 30. This was as Israel was preparing to enter the promised land. Deuteronomy 30, beginning in verse 4, going through verse 6. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. There is a promise that Moses made, a promise from God prior to entering Canaan. Verse 5, he will bring you to the land that belonged to your fathers. Remember, he promised this land to Abraham, re-promised it to Isaac, and restored it also to Jacob. And it goes on, and you will take possession of the land. God will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. You're going to outnumber everybody that's gone before you. The Lord, verse 6, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts. Remember, Paul made an issue of that. Circumcision of the flesh is not what's important, it's circumcision of the heart. And the hearts of your descendants as well, so that you may love him, God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and live. Gilead and Lebanon again represent lands that were earlier a part of the kingdom under David's reign. Gilead, for example, was also settled by 2.5 tribes before they entered Canaan. So they always had some portion east of the Jordan River. Lebanon, of course, would be further to the west and somewhat to the north. You ask, well, could this be God saying, I'm going to return the original promise boundaries to you? In Genesis 15, you get a quick look at that promise. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt, that'd be the Nile, to the great river, the Euphrates, which would be back up in the Babylonian territory. So from the Nile to the Euphrates was to belong totally to Israel. But as God said through Ezekiel, beginning in verse 27 of chapter 39, when I have brought them back from the nations, I'll bring them back from exile, and have gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will show myself holy through them in the sight of many nations. Israel is to be God's display. Verse 28, then they will know that I am the Lord their God, for though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. So we're going to see that in some sense, Jesus steps away from Israel temporarily. Paul will make an issue of that in Romans also. Zechariah says much the same thing as Ezekiel. They will pass through the sea. I'm reading verse 11 back in Zechariah 10. They will pass through the sea of trouble. The surging sea will be subdued, and all the depths of the Nile will dry up, and not going to be overrun with a flood of any sort. Assyria's pride will be brought down, and Egypt's scepter will pass away. In other words, those nations that once were powerhouses and overran Israel ain't going to continue. God says, I will deal with that. So, there is a promise that Israel will survive the long dispersion. God scattered them, but he'll bring them back. There's going to be difficulty and pain along the way. And of course, anybody who knows anything about Christianity, about Israel, knows the prices that that group of people has paid over the thousands of years, probably as many as 4,000 years, beginning back with Abraham. So here, Assyria and Egypt were probably, they were two of Israel's enemies, but they're probably used to simply symbolize all Israel's enemies. So I think God is saying, I'll take care of every enemy of Israel at some point in time. Verse 12 of Zechariah 10, I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will walk, declares the Lord. There's going to be a time when Israel will follow their God completely. It's going to be a final and eternal return as Israel comes back to the Lord. His power is going to strengthen Israel, just as his power is our strength as Christians. And Israel will glorify God and will be an obedient people. Couple of takeaways. God is good. No question about that. False idols, teachers, and prophets are not. Not what? Not good. Some God cares for, others he punishes. Remember? He cares for the people, but he punished the leaders for their incompetence, even downright idolatry. Fourth, Israel will be regathered at some point and will flourish as a united kingdom. Well, where do we go next? Well, we take a look at the rejection of the Messianic king. Here is Zechariah writing 500 years before Christ, and he's going to tell us that our Jesus was rejected by his people, the Jews. Hang on, because it's all prophecy from here on. Some of the most important prophecy in the Old Testament, some of the most important words for us